The rain had just stopped over Charleston, and the restaurant windows were still fogged at the edges, the kind of soft blur that made the candlelight inside look like something out of an old photograph. Emily Hartman sat alone at a table for two near the window, smoothing the napkin on her lap for the third time, checking her phone, then putting it face down again. She had told herself she wouldn't be nervous. She was 31, she had been on dates before, she knew how this worked. But there was something different about tonight. Something she couldn't quite name. And it sat low in her stomach like a stone. Her best friend Rachel had set this up. "Trust me," Rachel had said over coffee 2 weeks earlier, a strange glint in her eye that Emily should have paid more attention to. "He's kind. He's funny. He's exactly what you need after everything with Derek." Emily had agreed, mostly because she was tired of being alone, tired of takeout dinners in front of the television, tired of the quiet that had settled into her apartment since her divorce finalized. 8 months ago, what Emily didn't know was that Rachel and two other friends, Madison and Claire, had picked this date as something closer to a joke. They knew the man's name was Jonathan Cole. They had scrolled past his profile on a mutual friend's phone. They had seen a photo of him at a company barbecue, a heavy-set man in his late 30s with a kind, round face and a khaki and navy wardrobe that screamed accountant. Rachel and the others thought it would be entertaining to watch Emily's reaction when the man who showed up wasn't the tall, athletic type she usually dated. They hadn't done it out of cruelty, not exactly. It was the kind of thoughtless amusement people convince themselves is harmless because they never expect to get caught, and they never expect to be wrong. So there they were at a table across the restaurant, phones angled just enough to catch a clear shot of the door, waiting to record whatever expression crossed Emily's face the moment Jonathan walked in. He arrived at 7, exactly on time, wearing a navy polo shirt that fit him honestly rather than flatteringly, khaki pants, white sneakers he had clearly cleaned before leaving the house. He was broad through the shoulders and heavy through the middle, his face flushed slightly from the walk-in from the parking garage, his eyes searching the room with the particular vulnerability of a man who has been disappointed before and has decided to hope anyway. Emily saw him and her stomach did a small, honest flip, not of attraction exactly, but of surprise, quickly followed by something she wasn't proud of. A flicker of doubt. She caught herself in it immediately and pushed it down, ashamed. She stood, smiled, and said his name. "Jonathan?" "Joe, please," he said, extending a hand that was slightly damp with nerves. "Everybody calls me Joe, you must be Emily." Across the room, 3 phones lifted an inch higher. They sat. The conversation began the way most first dates do, stilted and polite. Questions about work and hobbies and how they knew Rachel. Emily worked as a pediatric occupational therapist at a clinic near the Battery, a job she loved because it let her watch small victories happen in real time. A child learning to hold a pencil, a child learning to tie a shoe. Joe listened to her talk about it with a stillness that surprised her. No interrupting, no waiting for his turn to speak, just listening. When she asked what he did, he said he ran a small furniture restoration workshop out of a converted warehouse near the Ashley River, that he had inherited the business from his father, who had inherited it from his father before that. "It's not glamorous," he said, "but there's something about taking a piece that everyone else has given up on and making it useful again. I like that part." Emily found herself leaning forward slightly. "That sounds like more than a job." "It is," Joe said, and something in his voice made it clear he meant it. The appetizers came, then the entrees, and somewhere between the second glass of wine and the shared dessert neither of them had planned to share, Emily forgot to notice that she had stopped performing politeness and started simply talking. Joe made her laugh twice, real laughs, the kind that surprised her out of herself. He asked about her divorce with a gentleness that didn't pry, and when she gave him the short, guarded version, he didn't fill the silence with advice or sympathy cliches. He just said, "That sounds like it took a lot out of you," and let the sentence sit there, true and unadorned. Across the restaurant, Rachel's phone had stopped recording 20 minutes ago. She sat watching Emily's face, the way it had softened, the way she kept tucking her hair behind her ear, the way she used to when she really liked someone, and Rachel felt the first cold twist of guilt settle into her chest. "This isn't funny anymore," she whispered to Madison. "It was never going to be funny," Claire said quietly. We just didn't think about that before we did it. Near the end of the meal, Joe excused himself to the restroom, and in the few minutes he was gone, something happened that none of them had planned for. An older woman at the next table, who had clearly been watching the two of them for a while, leaned toward Emily. "I don't mean to intrude," she said, "but I've been sitting here for an hour, and I have to say, that young man looks at you like you're the only person in the room. My husband used to look at me like that. 41 years married before he passed. You don't find that kind of attention very often. Don't let it go because of what anyone else thinks." Emily didn't know what to say. She only nodded, throat suddenly tight. When Joe returned, something in Emily had shifted, though she couldn't have explained exactly why. She looked at him differently, not as the surprise she had braced for at the door, but as a person, fully, the way she hadn't let herself look at anyone in a long time. "Can I be honest with you about something?" Joe asked once he'd sat back down, his voice suddenly quieter. Emily's stomach tightened. "Of course. I know this was probably set up as some kind of mismatch," he said, looking down at his hands rather than at her. "I've done this enough times to recognize the signs. Friends who think it's funny to pair up the awkward, overweight guy with someone who's clearly out of his league, just to see what happens. I'm not angry about it. I stopped being angry about that kind of thing a long time ago. I just wanted to say it out loud so it wasn't sitting between us the rest of the night. I had a really nice time tonight, whatever the reason I got invited." The words landed in Emily like a stone dropped into still water. She felt the ripples of it everywhere. In her chest, in her throat, in the sudden burn behind her eyes. Across the restaurant, Rachel stood up from her table, her face pale, and walked over without a plan. Without knowing what she would say when she got there, only knowing that she couldn't sit and watch this unfold from a distance any longer. "Emily," she said, arriving at the table, voice unsteady. "Joe, I have to say something." Joe looked up, guarded but not surprised, as though he'd already suspected exactly this. "I set this up as a joke," Rachel said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Madison, Claire, and I thought it would be funny to see Emily's reaction when someone different from what she usually dates walked through that door. It was cruel and it was stupid, and I am so sorry. To both of you." The table went silent. Emily stared at her friend, feeling something complicated rise in her chest. Embarrassment and anger and grief all tangled together. But when she turned back to Joe, expecting to see hurt or humiliation on his face, she saw instead something steadier than she expected, a kind of quiet dignity that had clearly been built over years of exactly this kind of moment. "I figured as much," Joe said simply. "It's all right. It's not the first time." He paused and then, looking directly at Emily for the first time since Rachel's confession, he added, "But I want to say, none of that changes what tonight actually was for me. I don't know what it was for you." Emily felt every eye at the table on her, waiting. She thought of Derek, of the years she'd spent trying to be small enough, easy enough, agreeable enough to keep a marriage from cracking, only to watch it crack anyway. She thought of the old woman at the next table and her 41 years. She thought of the way Joe had listened to her talk about her job like it mattered, the way he'd let her grief sit in the air without rushing to fix it. "It was the best date I've had in 3 years, Emily said. And she meant every word of it. Rachel exhaled, the tension leaving her shoulders. Though her guilt didn't fully disappear, it wouldn't. Not for a long time, and she knew she deserved that. She apologized once more, quietly, and returned to her table, leaving Emily and Joe alone again. "I'm sorry about her," Emily said. "That was humiliating, and it wasn't fair to you." "You don't have to apologize for someone else's mistake," Joe said. "You didn't do anything wrong tonight." "Neither did I." They sat a while longer after that, past the point where the waiter had cleared their plates, past the point where the restaurant had begun quietly dimming its lights for closing. They talked about small things now, easier things, the kind of conversation that happens after the hard part is over. Emily learned that Joe had never married, that he'd been engaged, once in his 20s, to a woman who left 2 months before the wedding, that he still restored a chair from that relationship because, he said, the wood didn't do anything wrong. When they finally stood to leave, Joe walked her to her car in the cool evening air. The streetlights catching the last of the rain still pooled on the sidewalk. At her door, he didn't lean in, didn't assume anything. He simply asked, "Would it be all right if I called you?" "No pressure. I just don't want tonight to be the only night." I'd like that, Emily said, and surprised herself with how much she meant it. 6 months later, on a Saturday afternoon in early spring, Emily stood in the doorway of Joe's workshop near the river, watching him sand down the arm of an old rocking chair, sawdust catching gold in the light from the high windows. She had come to bring him lunch, a habit that had become so normal to both of them neither remembered exactly when it started. Rachel had become close with both of them since that night, having spent the better part of the following year trying to make amends in the quiet, consistent way that actual friendship requires, and to her credit, she had never stopped. You're staring, Joe said without looking up, smiling. I'm allowed to stare at my boyfriend, Emily said, setting the paper bag down on his workbench. He looked up then, wiped his hands on his apron, and crossed the room to kiss her, the kind of unhurried kiss that comes from two people who are no longer trying to prove anything to each other, only choosing each other, again on an ordinary Saturday, for no reason except that it was true. Later they sat together on the workshop steps, eating sandwiches in the sun, and Emily thought about the night it all began, the humiliation that had been planned and the tenderness that had grown instead, the way something meant to be a joke had turned, against every intention, into the realest thing in her life. She thought about the old woman at the restaurant and hoped quietly that wherever she was, she'd approve. What are you thinking about? Joe asked, nudging her shoulder with his. Just that I almost missed this, Emily said. If I'd let one bad moment at the door decide the whole night. Joe took her hand, sawdust still faintly on his fingers, and said nothing because there was nothing that needed saying. The river moved slowly past the windows behind them, the spring light warm on their shoulders, and for the first time in a long time, Emily felt entirely quietly at home.